Hey there! Fancy meeting you here. I'm joking. I know you have to come here because you're in a class. Anyway, today we're going to talk about the importance of historical context when discussing theology. The main idea here is to understand that as human beings, our context affects the way that we understand the world, affects the way that we view the world, affects the way that we interpret the world. It's not a hard sell to say that if you were born at a completely different time period, in a completely different geographical location, you'd probably feel differently about some things. Why? Because your context would have changed. Our context, the setting, the time in which we live, the place in which we live, the things that happen around us when we're alive, all of that affects how we understand the world around us. One way to make this point is to discuss language. Language is interesting because we think of it as this way of communicating ideas, almost universally. That is, we say something and everybody's going to understand it. The complicated thing about language is that when you speak, not everybody is going to hear the exact same thing. Let me use an example to help make this point. The first thing that we want to say about language is that it signifies reality. However, how it signifies reality is always a little bit complicated. When I'm in class, I'll make this point with students by writing a phrase on the board, and I tell them I want them to tell me what the phrase means. Then I go ahead and write this phrase on the board: El gato. Almost instantly, most students will yell out that it means the cat. Even if they don't know Spanish fluently, most people know enough about Spanish to know that El gato translates as the cat. But it's interesting that they say it means the cat. Because then I try a different example. I'll write a different phrase on the board and I'll say, tell me what this one means. And this time I write this phrase: the cat. Most of the times people sit there a little confused. They're not sure what to say. The cat means the cat. But what's interesting about that little experiment is we think of other languages as meaning our language, as if our language were the true universal language. We think of our language not as meaning other language. Very few people will say the cat means el gato. But this highlights an interesting point. The cat does not mean el gato, and el gato does not mean the cat. Both of them refer to something in reality from a distance. They both refer to an animal that we call, in English, cat. So it's not that one means the other. Both have a way of expressing this reality. Now, this issue gets further complicated once we understand that even the idea of the cat might be culturally located. That is, it's very different depending on where we actually discuss the cat. So imagine a scenario. You're in New Jersey, sitting in your grandmother's house in the living room. Your grandmother comes in and says, "The cat is coming." I don't know why she sounds creepy like that, but never mind. At that point, your reaction is probably, okay, the cat's gonna come in. A nice, small, furry creature, sometimes relatable, secretly probably harboring some evil plot to overthrow humans, but still good for a pet and a nice little cuddle. That's because the cat, in this particular context, signifies that kind of an animal, that kind of an encounter. Now imagine changing your context. Imagine that you're in a sub-Saharan African country, in a tribal region. You're sitting in a circle just discussing some things with people. Somebody runs over to the circle and says, "The cat is coming." Well, certainly we're not expecting that a small, cute house cat is coming over looking for some cuddles. No, in this case, you're probably talking about a lion, and the lion is coming for, well, who knows, maybe dinner. In one scenario, if you say, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty," you might end up in a very pleasant, happy situation. In the other scenario, you're about to get mauled. All this is to suggest that context matters. The context in which we speak affects what we are intending to say. This idea is important for theology too, especially when we discuss something like tradition and the creeds. And this is the point I'd like to make today. Take something like the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed talks about believing in God, and it talks about believing in Jesus. But what it says about Jesus is very interesting. It says that he was born of the Virgin Mary. It says that he suffered under Pontius Pilate. He died and was buried, and then rose again on the third day. What's interesting about that is that statement of belief does hit many important ideas of Christianity with regard to Jesus. But it skips a whole lot. In between the time when Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary and suffered under Pontius Pilate, he lived a kind of important life. His teachings, his actions, his idea of spreading the kingdom of God, especially in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these were very, very important ideas. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says the proclamation of the kingdom of God was the very reason that he was sent. And yet, the idea of the kingdom of God and Jesus' healings and his teachings, none of them make it into the Apostles' Creed. We can also say the same thing about the Nicene Creed, which skips from Jesus' birth to his suffering and death. Why is this important? It's important because at the time that these creeds were being put forward, the main things that were being discussed were Jesus' identity, his nature. Was he God? Was he human? Was he some third order of being? None of these ideas in particular required a close scrutiny of Jesus' life and teachings. However, it would be ludicrous to claim that Jesus' life and teachings are not essential to the Christian faith. So why don't they make the creed? Well, they don't make the creed for the simple reason that historically, contextually at that time, they weren't being debated. Now, fast forward 1,500 years or so into the future to us today. We look at the creeds and say, this is what is essential for the Christian faith. But the danger here is to fail to recognize that the creeds, like all tradition, were historically located. They were influenced by the context in which they were developed. And for us today to say that the creeds essentially capture everything that's important about the Christian faith risks losing the centrality of the ideas like the kingdom of God, Jesus' teachings about poverty, Jesus' healings, Jesus' desire to challenge the status quo and be on the side of the poor and the marginalized. All of these were essential to who Jesus was in the Gospels. All of this to say, in a nutshell, that everything that we say theologically is grounded in our historical context. The kinds of things we focus on tend to be reflective of the kind of world in which we live, the ideas that are being challenged at that time. The danger then of tradition is failing to recognize that even the tradition was located in a historical context and might not capture everything that's important to capture today. As one example, someone may ask the question, with regard to the immigration debate today, what's more important to know? That Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, or that Jesus at the time was a refugee trying to escape political tyranny. One of them is in the creed, and one of them is not. Now, I don't say that to get overly political on you. I'm just trying to highlight that the idea of context might change what we focus on. And so, the idea that I want you to focus on this week for your prompts is this. What is the best way to read the creeds, understanding one, that they were very contextually located, and two, that they don't cover some of the essential ideas that we want to probably focus on in Christianity, in particular, Jesus' life and teachings. Are the creeds still useful? And if so, how are they useful? And how do we integrate these other important parts of Jesus' life and thought into our understanding of Christianity? All right, have an enjoyable week.